Rain drifted across the narrow London street in patient silver threads, turning the cobblestones slick and reflective beneath the weak glow of gas lamps. Carriages rolled past with quiet dignity, their wheels whispering over stone, while well-dressed ladies hurried beneath parasols to avoid the damp wind. Yet within a modest jeweler's shop tucked between a milliner and a bookseller, another kind of storm gathered, one made not of clouds and rain, but of whispers, glances, and the fragile pride of a woman determined not to break. Lady Eliza Whitmore stood at the polished counter, her gloved hands folded carefully before her. Morning black draped her slender frame, the fabric plain yet elegant, as though dignity itself had been stitched into its seams. A thin veil shadowed her pale face, though it did little to conceal the quiet resolve in her eyes. Only a year had passed since her husband's death, yet time had already carved a deeper loneliness into her posture. London remembered her not as the graceful young bride she once had been, but as the widow of a man whose reckless debts had echoed through drawing rooms like scandalous music. Before her on the velvet cloth lay the remnants of another life, a diamond brooch shaped like a cluster of winter stars, and a delicate necklace of pearls that glimmered softly beneath the lamplight. They had once adorned her throat and collar at glittering dinners and candlelit dances. Now they lay silent and exposed, as if aware that they were about to be traded for something far less romantic: survival. The jeweler, a thin man with spectacles perched sharply upon his nose, examined the pieces with professional detachment. His magnifying lens hovered over the diamonds as though searching for flaws not only in the jewels but in the woman who brought them. He murmured after a long moment, his voice carrying the indifferent tone of commerce. They are fine pieces, certainly, though the market has become rather uncertain of late. Lady Eliza inclined her head slightly. I understand, she said softly, her voice steady despite the quiet tremor beneath it. I should be grateful for whatever price you find reasonable. Behind her, two ladies lingered near the display case of engagement rings, their curiosity poorly disguised. Their silk gowns rustled as they leaned toward one another, their whispers floating just loud enough to reach Eliza's ears. Is that not Lady Whitmore? One murmured. The very same, replied the other. Her husband gambled away half his estate before the poor man died. I heard the creditors have been circling ever since. How dreadful, the first said, though her tone suggested fascination more than sympathy. Eliza did not turn. Years of polite society had trained her well in the art of silence. A lady did not answer whispers, she simply endured them. The jeweler cleared his throat and set down the magnifying lens. Given the circumstances, he said cautiously, I could offer £200 for both pieces. For a moment the shop seemed to grow impossibly still. £200 was an insult, barely a fraction of their worth, but Eliza had already anticipated this moment. Pride, she had learned, could not be exchanged at the bank. Very well, she replied after a brief pause. That will suffice. As the jeweler reached for a ledger to finalize the sale, the bell above the door chimed softly. No one paid much attention at first. The entrance of another gentleman into a jeweler's shop was hardly remarkable. Yet the hush that followed carried a subtle change in the air, like the faint shift that precedes thunder. Tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably composed, the newcomer removed his gloves with deliberate calm. His dark coat was tailored with understated perfection, and the quiet authority in his posture spoke of a man accustomed to obedience. It was the Duke of Ravenshurst. Alexander Ravenshurst had long been regarded as one of the most formidable men in England. His estate stretched across counties, his influence reached into Parliament, and his reputation carried the weight of quiet discipline. Those who knew him described a man of restraint, intelligence, and an almost unnerving ability to observe the world without revealing his own thoughts. Now those thoughtful gray eyes rested upon the scene before him. He had not expected to see her. Lady Eliza Whitmore remained unaware of his presence, her attention fixed upon the small transaction that threatened to erase the last glittering fragments of her past. The veil could not conceal the gentle curve of her cheek or the quiet grace in the way she held herself against humiliation. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest, an old, familiar ache he had buried long ago. Years earlier he had watched her laugh beneath ballroom chandeliers, her youth bright as the candles that illuminated her golden hair. In those days he had told himself that admiration was harmless, that duty demanded silence, that society had already chosen her path. She had married another man within months. Alexander had congratulated her with perfect composure, though the memory of that evening had followed him like a shadow ever since. And now here she stood, selling the last symbols of her dignity to survive the wreckage of another man's folly. The jeweler began recording the details of the purchase while the pearls and diamonds waited upon the velvet cloth like fallen stars. Alexander stepped forward. The shopkeeper immediately straightened, startled by the presence of such a distinguished patron. "Your Grace," he said quickly, bowing his head. Alexander's gaze flicked briefly toward the jewels, then toward Lady Eliza. "Tell me," he said quietly, his voice smooth as winter wind, "what price have you offered the lady?" £200, Your Grace," the jeweler replied nervously. A faint pause settled between them. Alexander leaned slightly closer, his voice lowering into a confidential murmur meant only for the shopkeeper's ears. The whisper lasted barely a second. Yet when the jeweler straightened again, his expression had changed entirely. "My apologies, Lady Whitmore," he said suddenly, clearing his throat. "Upon further consideration, the value of these pieces is considerably higher than I first believed." He pushed the ledger aside and looked at her with awkward eagerness. "I should say the proper price would be £2,000. The two whispering ladies gasped softly behind her. Eliza blinked in quiet astonishment. For the first time since entering the shop, she turned and found herself face to face with the man whose presence had silently altered her fate. A thin morning mist clung to the cobblestones as Lady Eliza Whitmore stepped cautiously along the street, her gloves damp from the lingering drizzle. In her hand she carried a small, unassuming parcel, soft velvet encasing the diamond brooch she had been compelled to sell just the day before. Somehow, the weight of the gift felt heavier than any jewel she had ever worn. Its presence was a question she could not yet answer. The note that had accompanied it remained folded against the box, a single line of ink whispering a sentiment that seemed almost impossibly intimate. Some memories should never be sold. She traced the words with a fingertip, feeling their warmth and the faint tremor of a heart that had been long denied solace. The streets of London were awakening to the hum of the city. Carriage wheels clattered over stone, vendors cried their wares, and ladies in silken skirts maneuvered umbrellas against the lingering drizzle. Yet despite the bustle, Eliza felt as though the world had contracted to the pulse of her own heart. Every shadow of passing hats and coats seemed to echo the memory of last evening, the subtle defiance of being observed, the hushed glances of society, and above all, the commanding presence of the man whose intentions she could neither read nor resist. By noon, a carriage arrived at the door of her small lodgings, its polished surface reflecting the pallid sunlight that fought through London's grey veil. She hesitated for a heartbeat, wondering who could have sent it, before the coachman's courteous nod summoned her attention. Inside lay a card embossed with the Duke's seal. The message, brief and formal, requested her attendance at an evening gathering. The invitation carried neither explanation nor pretense, yet in its silent demand there was an unmistakable authority. Eliza's pulse quickened. Acceptance would thrust her once more into the scrutiny of society, yet to refuse might risk offending the very man who had altered her life with a simple whisper the previous day. As the day waned and the evening lanterns flickered to life, she donned her simplest gown of midnight blue. Its velvet embraced her slender figure modestly, and the faint shimmer of jet beads along her neckline offered the barest hint of refinement. Even in simplicity, she could not hide the lingering tension in her posture, the invisible weight of suspicion and expectation pressing against her. Outside, carriages rolled in their silent rhythm, and the gates of the estate opened to admit her into a world both alien and familiar. Polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers dripping with golden light, and the soft hum of conversation moderated by polite laughter. Within moments, her presence became a subject of attention. Eyes tracked her movement, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment. She noticed the faint rise of eyebrows, the whispered speculation that trailed behind each bow and curtsy she performed. And yet, amidst the sea of gazes, one figure remained immovable: Alexander Ravenshurst, Duke of Ravenshurst. He leaned against a column as though sculpted from the shadows themselves, his posture relaxed but watchful, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stirred something long dormant in her chest. She felt it immediately, the gravity of being seen without pretense. In a ballroom teeming with vanity and performance, he alone observed her with a patience that made the trivial judgments of the crowd fade into insignificance. And when he stepped forward, his approach was deliberate, the subtle scent of cedarwood and leather preceding him, a faint warmth in the air that spoke of purpose and attention. "Lady Eliza," he said, his voice measured yet resonant, carrying the weight of familiarity and something more tender beneath. "It seems London owes you more courtesy than it has yet offered." She inclined her head, the merest tilt betraying both acknowledgment and guarded suspicion. "You are too kind, Your Grace," she replied, the politeness of her tone betraying a flicker of surprise she could not entirely suppress. Her voice, low and controlled, seemed to carry her restraint like a shield, though her heart thumped in unmistakable recognition. For a moment they walked together, exchanging few words but enough to allow the quiet charge of presence to speak between them. The orchestra swelled with a waltz, and the dancers flowed around them like currents of light and shadow. Every glance, every pause, seemed freighted with meanings that neither dared to articulate fully. Whispers followed, of course. Society rarely forgave even the faintest hint of intimacy, particularly between a powerful duke and a recently widowed lady whose finances were, by rumor, precarious. The evening progressed with a delicate tension, a dance of civility layered over subtle challenges. A lady nearby leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, and whispered in clipped tones about the impropriety of the duke's attentions. Eliza heard, though she did not react. She had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than protest. Yet beneath her composure, a storm of emotion churned, gratitude, confusion, anticipation, and the unacknowledged desire for an acknowledgement she had long denied herself. As the night deepened, the Duke produced a small ornate box from the folds of his coat and extended it toward her. Its velvet was familiar, yet the elegance suggested a gesture far beyond the ordinary. "I thought it best," he said, his voice softening in that subtle, compelling way that left no room for falsehood, "that what you believed lost might find its way home." Eliza accepted the box, her fingers brushing against his in a fleeting contact that carried more significance than any words could convey. Inside lay the brooch she had sold, the diamonds catching the lamplight with the same brilliance she remembered, and a single pearl necklace perfect and unspoiled. Alongside it was another note equally brief. "No fortune can measure the value of what is held in the heart." Her breath caught at the words and a flush rose to her cheeks. For the first time in months, she felt the tension in her spine loosen, replaced by a trembling awareness that some part of her dignity had been preserved, not by circumstance, not by the mercies of a society too ready to judge, but by the deliberate care of a man whose intentions were as incomprehensible as they were undeniable. Yet even as warmth spread through her chest, a shadow of uncertainty lingered. Who had sanctioned such generosity, and for what purpose? Why would a man of his standing concern himself with the delicate unraveling of her fortunes? Questions crowded her mind, sharp and persistent, but before she could form them, the Duke offered a bow, a gesture of both civility and intimacy that left her unmoored. "Shall we dance?" he asked, his gray eyes searching hers for an answer that was more instinct than reason. She hesitated, aware of every observer in the room, every whisper waiting to attach itself to her name. And yet, the pull was undeniable, the silent understanding that, for the first time in months, she was no longer navigating her precarious position alone. With a careful nod, she allowed him to guide her onto the dance floor, their movements tentative at first, then gradually flowing with the music. Around them, the ballroom shimmered with light and expectation, yet their small orbit seemed to exist outside it, a bubble of warmth and quiet acknowledgement. And as the music swelled, as the chandeliers reflected their tentative unity in fragmented gold, Eliza could not help but sense the shift. Something had begun, an invisible, irrevocable change that neither fortune nor society could undo. And then, just as the waltz reached its climax, the Duke's voice, low and unwavering, whispered in a manner meant only for her, "This evening is only the beginning, Lady Eliza. What comes next, I cannot yet reveal." The words lingered between them like smoke over a candle flame, leaving her suspended in a fragile tension between hope and fear, anticipation and uncertainty, and a sense that the path ahead was poised to alter everything she had believed about love, honor, and destiny. The fire crackled low in the Duke's library, casting flickering shadows across the high shelves of leather-bound volumes. Rain pelted against the tall windows, the sound like distant drums echoing the quiet tension within the room. Lady Eliza Whitmore stood near the hearth, her gloved hands folded before her, the velvet of her gown absorbing the dim warmth yet doing little to shield her from the chill of uncertainty that clung to her heart. The Duke, Alexander Ravenshurst, paced slowly, each movement deliberate, measured, as though the weight of his words required exacting preparation. His gray eyes, deep and unwavering, fixed upon her with a gravity that made the world outside disappear. "You came willingly," he began, his voice low yet resonant, though the circumstances might have suggested otherwise. He paused, letting the sound of the rain fill the silence, letting her feel the space between them, as if the storm itself were an accomplice to this confession. Eliza's lips pressed into a thin line. "I do not presume to dictate the terms of your intentions, Your Grace," she replied, careful, restrained, yet not entirely free of tremor. Her voice carried a polite steadiness, though inside her chest, her heart raced against a torrent of questions she dared not articulate. Every whispered speculation, every glance of judgment from the ballroom earlier, had prepared her for scrutiny. Yet here, in the quiet sanctity of the library, the scrutiny was personal, piercing, intimate. Alexander stopped pacing and let his gaze drift to the flickering fire before returning to her. "I have observed you, Eliza, far longer than propriety might permit." The words fell like gentle stones, each one landing with deliberate weight. "Before your marriage, before the world insisted upon its narrative of duty and expectation, I cared for you. I still care for you." The confession hung in the air, and Eliza felt the room tilt ever so slightly beneath her feet. The notion of love unspoken, long held in silence, had always existed as a distant, impossible echo. She had known admiration, perhaps even longing, had brushed the edges of her life like the fleeting warmth of candlelight, but to hear it named so plainly now stirred both fear and a tender ache she could not deny. "You loved me?" she whispered, scarcely believing the sound of her own voice. A laugh, soft and incredulous, threatened to escape her, but she swallowed it. There was shame here too, the lingering shame of a widow and the shadow of a past marriage that had never fulfilled the promise of joy. "While I was married? While my world belonged to another?" Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. The firelight painted sharp lines across his face, revealing both restraint and a quiet torment. "Yes, I loved you," he admitted finally, the words deliberate, the confession a small, brave act against the rigid expectations of society. "I remained silent, as one must when duty, honor, and family interfere with the desires of the heart. And yet each day I have lived with the knowledge that I could have done more, should have done more." Eliza lowered her gaze, the flickering flames reflecting in her eyes as she traced the edges of her own despair. "And now," she asked, voice trembling, "now that I am left with nothing but fragments of what once was, what is to be done?" Alexander stepped closer, the soft leather of his boots muted against the Persian rug. "Now I make a declaration, though not yet to the world. You are no longer alone in your plight. I will ensure that your burdens are lifted, that your dignity is restored. But more than that," his voice softened, almost a whisper, "I will not allow the past to dictate the remainder of your life." Her pulse quickened. The sensation of hope, long starved and fragile, began to stir beneath the layers of grief and caution. Yet even as it grew, so too did the apprehension. Could she trust the Duke's intentions? Could she reconcile the quiet knowledge of his power with the vulnerability of her own heart? The very thought was dizzying, and the flickering fire seemed to amplify the tremor in her hands. "Alexander," she said finally, using the name without the formality that so often shielded them both, "I am grateful, of course, more than I can properly articulate. Yet gratitude does not erase caution. It cannot erase the years that have made me wary of those who would claim to care." He nodded slowly, understanding the subtext without need for elaboration. "I do not ask for your trust outright," he replied, his voice steady, calm, unwavering. "I ask only that you allow me the opportunity to demonstrate it. I have altered little of the world, Eliza, but I can alter what is within my power. Your debts, your reputation, and, if you will permit it, your heart." Eliza's breath caught. The notion of a heart reclaimed, of dignity restored, was intoxicating, yet it carried the weight of incredulity. Her lips parted, yet words failed her, leaving only the sensation of quiet astonishment and an unbidden tear that glistened in the firelight. The silence stretched, punctuated by the gentle hiss of the rain and the slow pop of the fire. In that space, past and present collided. The memory of her husband's debts, the ballroom whispers, the stolen glances of society, and the sudden, improbable care of the Duke converging into a delicate tension that neither dared to break. Alexander moved closer, closing a fraction of the distance between them without pressure, without haste. "Do not mistake my actions for mere charity, Eliza," he murmured. "You are not an object to be rescued, but a woman I have long admired and continue to hold in the highest regard. I will not speak to society on your behalf unless you permit it. I will not impose unless you allow. But what I offer is a chance for both of us to amend the silence that has haunted us for years." Her hands, once folded neatly, now twisted the folds of her gown. "And yet," she began, her voice soft, hesitant, "the world will not remain silent. Even with your intervention, the whispers will follow me. They will question motives, judge the morality of the arrangement. Can the Duke truly care without question, without expectation?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he extended a gloved hand toward her, a gesture both simple and profound. "Care does not require justification," he said quietly, "nor does it ask for proof. But I ask for your consideration, and perhaps your patience." Eliza hesitated, her eyes flicking to the hand, to the firelight, to the shadowed corners of the library where secrets and judgments lurked. And then, slowly, she allowed her fingers to brush against his, tentative and cautious. The contact sent a tremor through her, a promise of understanding, of an alliance forged not of necessity alone, but of mutual acknowledgement and unspoken longing. The fire's glow danced across their faces, illuminating a shift that neither could yet define. Past regrets, present fears, and the uncertain promise of what might come converged in a fragile equilibrium, as if the room itself held its breath. And just as the warmth of proximity began to thaw the icy edges of her apprehension, a soft knock echoed through the library doors. The sound was hesitant, deliberate, too deliberate to be casual. Alexander's brow furrowed, a shadow of concern crossing his composed features. Before either could speak, the servant's voice, quiet yet urgent, carried through the room. "Pardon, your grace, but there are gentlemen outside, creditors, madam, insisting upon immediate audience regarding Lady Eliza's late husband's debts." The words landed like stones in the quiet chamber, and the fragile hope suspended between them wavered. Eliza's grip on the Duke's hand tightened ever so slightly, and the flickering fire cast long shadows over both their faces, mirroring the sudden, pressing weight of society's unrelenting scrutiny. Alexander's eyes, steadfast and unwavering, met hers. "Then we must act," he said quietly, with the calm authority of a man who had weathered storms far greater than this. "But know this, Eliza, no force, no rumor, no debt shall dictate what is rightfully yours." And in that charged moment, with rain still thrumming against the glass and the shadows of the library growing long, Eliza understood that her life, her dignity, her heart, was poised at the edge of a decision that would change everything. The grand hall of the Ravenshurst estate was alive with light and music, a glittering sea of silk gowns, polished boots, and crystal chandeliers that scattered the glow across marble floors. The soft strains of a string quartet floated above polite laughter, yet beneath the surface of elegance, tension threaded the air like an invisible cord. Lady Eliza Whitmore stood at the edge of the ballroom, her posture poised yet taut, every movement measured. She wore a gown of deep emerald, its fabric clinging gently to her form, the subtle sheen catching the candlelight with each hesitant step. Even as she advanced, whispers followed, barely audible at first, then sharpening with unmistakable judgment. She was a widow, vulnerable, recently rescued from the humiliation of public scandal, yet society's gaze could not help but linger with curiosity and faint disapproval. At her side, Duke Alexander Ravenshurst maintained a calm, commanding presence. His eyes scanned the room with quiet vigilance, noting every whisper, every sideways glance, every raised eyebrow. The whispers of society did not escape him, nor did the subtle murmurs of suspicion aimed at the lady he had chosen to protect. He had spent decades mastering the art of observation, of reading intent behind polite facades. Yet tonight, every glance directed at Eliza was a challenge, a test not only of her resilience but of his own resolve. He would not allow scandal to dictate the terms of their encounter, nor would he permit the judgments of others to overshadow what had begun to bloom quietly between them. As the orchestra shifted to a waltz, the murmurs of the assembly rose and fell like a tide, punctuated by occasional exclamations of admiration or surprise. Eliza's chest tightened as she felt the weight of all eyes upon her. A gentle shiver traced the line of her spine, and for a moment she wondered whether courage alone would suffice. She had walked into this hall armed with dignity, yet each step felt like a negotiation with both fear and expectation. Alexander extended his hand, the motion fluid and deliberate, an anchor in the storm of scrutiny. "Lady Eliza," he murmured, his voice steady but threaded with warmth, "may I have the honor?" His words were simple, yet the intensity behind them carried a gravity that belied any social convention. Eliza's fingers trembled as they brushed against his, and the connection sparked a current neither of them could ignore. She allowed herself to be led to the floor, the movement of the dance both grounding and liberating. Around them, the hall swirled with gilded spectators, yet in that moment they seemed invisible, irrelevant to the space that had been carved out between their two hearts. Even as the rhythm of the waltz carried them gracefully through the hall, a subtle tension lingered in the edges of Eliza's mind. This was not a simple dance, not a mere gesture of politeness. Society's judgment had the power to wound as sharply as any blade, and the presence of creditors, Creditors who had pursued her family relentlessly since her late husband's debts hung like a shadow just beyond the glow of the chandeliers. She had spent months navigating humiliation and fear, and even now, the possibility of public disgrace pressed against her like a tide threatening to overwhelm. Alexander seemed to sense her unease. He guided her through the movements of the dance with a fluidity that suggested both authority and care, his gray eyes never leaving hers. "You need not bear this burden alone," he said quietly, words meant only for her, yet resonant enough to echo in the spaces between thought and fear. "Whatever forces seek to diminish you, whatever whispers attempt to wound your dignity, I will ensure they find no purchase." Eliza's breath caught at the conviction in his voice. His words were not mere comfort. They were a promise, an unspoken vow that the weight of judgment could be met with deliberate action. And yet, the fear remained, an undercurrent beneath the warmth of hope, because she knew that power could be both protective and imposing. The Duke's willingness to act on her behalf was admirable, yet the very magnitude of his influence cast its own shadow over the fragile trust she dared to place in him. The dance concluded, and the orchestra shifted to a slower, more deliberate rhythm. Alexander guided her to a quiet alcove near the windows, where the glow of gas lamps outside cast the room in a soft, amber haze. The murmurs of the crowd faded, replaced by the subtle crackle of the fireplace and the occasional clink of glasses in the distant hall. Here, in this space, the constraints of society's gaze were momentarily lifted, allowing an intimacy that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I must speak plainly," Alexander said, his voice low, resonant, carrying the weight of conviction. "The creditors who shadow your family are not idle. They intend to press claims, to force public acknowledgement of debts that were never truly yours to bear. Their methods are insidious, their purpose unyielding. I will confront them, Eliza. I will settle what must be settled, and I will do so in a manner that preserves your dignity, not merely your fortune." Eliza's eyes widened, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over her. The thought of the Duke confronting her persecutors directly was simultaneously comforting and overwhelming. She had long been accustomed to managing disgrace in quiet, solitary ways, relying on composure as both armor and refuge. To have a man of his power intercede on her behalf was a relief beyond measure, yet it also forced her to confront feelings she had tried to suppress: admiration, trust, and the undeniable pull of her own heart toward the man who had long occupied her thoughts in silence. "Alexander," she said softly, the single use of his name carrying a weight she had never dared lend before, "I am grateful, more than I can properly express. But must it truly be so public? Must the world bear witness to the restitution of my dignity?" He smiled faintly, a rare expression softening the rigid lines of his features. "Sometimes, Eliza, the world must see that justice can be enacted, that wrongs can be corrected, and that courage need not be solitary. Yet I assure you, it will not be a spectacle of humiliation, but a testament to the truth, your honor preserved." She considered his words, feeling both the stirring of hope and the tremor of apprehension. The room itself seemed to breathe with the anticipation that had begun to take hold, the flicker of candlelight echoing the tentative shift in her own heart. With Alexander at her side, the weight of past shame felt momentarily lightened, yet she knew the challenge of society's scrutiny remained, a storm waiting to test the fragile alignment of power, trust, and desire. As the evening continued, whispers drifted toward them once more. Curious glances, sharp exhalations of judgment, and half-formed suspicions brushed against the edges of their sanctuary. But Alexander's presence remained a steadying force, a shield against both the cruelty and the curiosity of observers. And in that stability, Eliza began to feel the contours of something previously unimaginable, not just relief but the cautious, thrilling emergence of hope. Then, as if drawn by an unspoken signal, a gentleman approached the edge of the dance floor. His voice was low, urgent, but civil, carrying news that could not be ignored. "Your Grace, the creditors who have pursued Lady Eliza's family insist upon immediate audience. They demand acknowledgement, and they threaten proceedings should their claims not be satisfied tonight." Eliza's heart sank, and a quiet shiver passed through her. The world outside this intimate alcove had not forgotten, had not forgiven. The threats of shame and social humiliation pressed once more against her, threatening to undo the fragile balance she had begun to feel. Alexander's gray eyes met hers, steady, resolute, and unwavering. "Then we shall act," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, yet threaded with the authority of a man accustomed to shaping outcomes. "We will confront them, yes, but we shall do so on terms that honor you. And I will see that every whisper of scorn is met not with fear, but with the truth of what is just. Eliza's fingers tightened around the folds of her gown, the emerald fabric trembling beneath her grip. For the first time, she realized the magnitude of what had begun. A confrontation that would test not only society's assumptions but the strength of their connection, the depth of trust, and the courage of two hearts poised to defy both judgment and expectation. And as the orchestra swelled once more, casting gilded reflections across polished marble, she felt the pull of inevitability, that the night would reach a moment of reckoning, and when it did, nothing would remain unchanged. The first light of spring spilled across the rolling fields of the Ravenshurst estate, soft and golden, warming the dew-drenched gardens where white roses unfurled in delicate profusion. Lady Eliza Whitmore walked slowly along the cobblestone path, her gloved hand brushing the blossoms as if to confirm that such beauty could exist without pretense or judgment. The events of the past months still lingered in her mind. The humiliation, the whispered scandals, the suffocating expectations of society. But here, in the sanctuary of Alexander Ravenshurst's estate, they had begun to lose their power. The burden of debts had been lifted, courtesy of the Duke's decisive intervention, and with it, the oppressive weight of gossip that had threatened to consume her dignity. She paused near a fountain, the water sparkling in the morning sun, and allowed herself a quiet exhale, a release she had not permitted in many long months. Behind her, the sound of measured footsteps approached, and she knew without turning who it was. Alexander emerged from the shadow of the hedge, his dark coat tailored to perfection, the subtle scent of cedarwood mingling with the fragrance of roses. He moved with the calm authority of a man accustomed to shaping events, yet there was softness in the way his gray eyes rested upon her, a tenderness that had grown through months of shared struggle and quiet understanding. "Eliza," he said, his voice low, carrying both relief and restrained joy. "The world may have sought to define you by loss, by scandal, by whispers that sting sharper than any blade. But here you are neither judged nor diminished. You are as you were always meant to be, strong, resilient, and wholly yourself." Her lips curved in a hesitant smile, though her eyes glistened with a mixture of gratitude and lingering vulnerability. "And yet," she said softly, "I know the world beyond these gates is not so forgiving. Even with your protection, Alexander, society will always seek to remind me of the past." He stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. "Let them whisper," he said firmly, the authority in his tone unshakable. "Let them speculate and cast judgment. I have ensured that your debts are cleared, that no creditor, no rumor, and no callous remark can compromise your dignity. The rest," he gestured to the estate, the gardens, the vast and protective landscape, "the rest is ours to shape together." Eliza felt the warmth of his hand envelop hers, and a quiet peace settled over her. The Duke had not simply removed the burdens that weighed upon her. He had acted as a guardian of her spirit, reinforcing the fragile boundaries of hope that had begun to grow within her. And in that gesture, in that steady, deliberate presence, she sensed the unspoken truth, that what had begun as protection had evolved into something deeper, more intimate, and irrevocably entwined with her own heart. They walked together through the rose gardens, the petals brushing against their sleeves, the sweet fragrance filling the air with the promise of renewal. Conversation was sparse, yet every word, every glance, carried meaning. Alexander spoke occasionally of matters requiring attention: estate decisions, the care of servants, the proper handling of lingering financial obligations, but each statement was imbued with a subtle understanding of her presence, a recognition that her dignity and voice mattered. At a small, secluded terrace overlooking the estate's rolling hills, Alexander finally paused, his gaze sweeping over the landscape before returning to her. "Eliza," he said, softer now, as if sharing a secret with the wind itself, "I cannot claim to have predicted this path, nor can I promise that life will be without its trials. But I can promise this, that whatever storms approach, we face them together. I have watched you endure with courage beyond measure, and I have come to understand that my own heart finds its true course only in your presence." Eliza's chest tightened. She had long struggled to reconcile gratitude with desire, independence with reliance, the long-held fears of a woman left vulnerable with the stirrings of hope and affection she could no longer deny. Her voice, when it emerged, was soft yet unwavering. "Alexander, all that I am, all that I have endured has brought me here, to this moment. And yet, I had never imagined a heart such as yours would see me with such clarity, such patience, such care." He took a deliberate step closer, the space between them narrowing until the warmth of proximity was undeniable. "Then let us not imagine further," he said, his tone measured, commanding yet tender. "Let us act with the full knowledge that the past need not dictate our future. Eliza, I offer you not charity nor mere protection, but a life of choice, respect, and the deepest regard my heart can offer." Her breath caught, and for a moment words failed her. The long months of struggle, the whispered judgments, the quiet pain of isolation, all converged into a single, overwhelming clarity. She realized with a mixture of awe and relief that she had been seen fully, acknowledged wholly, and held in regard beyond the constraints of society's judgment. Alexander's hand rose, a subtle, deliberate gesture, as if to invite her into the final step of an unspoken agreement. "Will you accept this life with me?" he asked, his gray eyes locked upon hers, unwavering, unflinching, tender in their demand for honesty. "Will you trust that together, we may navigate both the storms of the world and the quiet currents of the heart?" Eliza's fingers closed around his, her hand trembling only slightly, and a smile broke across her face, tentative yet luminous. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying both affirmation and the full weight of a heart long constrained. "Yes, Alexander. I will trust you." The Duke's expression softened, the first true smile touching the edges of his eyes as he lowered one hand to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. It was a gesture of intimacy and care, deliberate and reverent, as if to acknowledge not only her consent but the fragile beauty of trust newly offered. The garden seemed to respond in kind, the sun breaking fully through morning mist, the roses trembling as if stirred by the gravity of their connection, the gentle hum of life around them echoing a promise that even society's shadows could not obscure. A distant carriage rumbled along the gravel drive, a reminder that the world still turned beyond the estate gates. Yet in this moment, the expanse of rolling hills, the scent of blossoms, and the quiet strength of mutual understanding created a sanctuary, a sphere where past grievances, scandal, and fear were suspended, held at bay by the steadfast presence of shared intent. Alexander drew Eliza into a slow, deliberate walk along the terrace, their hands intertwined, their steps measured to the rhythm of hearts newly aligned. The Duke spoke then, softly, words that seemed meant to linger in the air as much as in her mind. "Eliza, you sold your jewels that day believing necessity required it. Yet in that act, unknowingly, you preserved the heart I have longed for. Fate, it seems, has a curious way of repaying patience with opportunity." Eliza's smile widened, a laugh escaping softly, unguarded, freeing. The last vestiges of doubt, of shame, of social constraint, began to dissipate like mist in the morning sun. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to step fully into a future not dictated by fear or circumstance, but by choice, by love, by the deliberate courage of two hearts meeting without pretense. Alexander leaned closer, their foreheads nearly touching, and whispered, "Together we shall define the measure of our days, not by scandal, not by debt, not by the judgment of others, but by the depth of truth we hold for one another." Eliza's eyes shone with unrestrained emotion, and in that gaze, Alexander found a reflection of his own relief, joy, and abiding affection. The sun rose fully above the estate, illuminating the gardens, the terrace, and the path ahead, a path no longer overshadowed by whispers, debts, or sorrow, but brightened by the certainty of trust, the promise of love, and the unshakable bond of hearts finally aligned. And in that luminous clarity, as the morning light settled upon them, the past dissolved into a memory, the future opened like the bloom of a rose, and both knew with absolute certainty that the journey ahead would be theirs alone to shape.